And what they talked about was the extraordinary efforts that cigarette companies were going to market cigarettes, not only to adults, but also to children. And the, the, the slide presentations that they had were slide after slide after slide of cigarette marketing in places where you wouldn't expect it necessarily, in remote areas of the world, in some of the poorest areas of the world, in places where nobody else could get to. And here they were marketing to cigarettes to the people in those places. And in particular, the presentation on marketing to children was life changing for me because I knew that cigarette companies marketed to children, but the marketing was so ubiquitous and just so much a part of the normal landscape. I never noticed it or paid any attention to it. And of course, I realized you're not supposed to pay attention to it because if you pay attention to it, you will start thinking. And if you start thinking, you'll realize how bad this is. And so I walked out of that meeting thinking, we in nutrition should be doing exactly what the anti smoking community is doing for smoking. We should be paying much more attention to marketing. And that's really what did it.
Well, Professor Marion Nestle, author of numerous books, including most recently Slow Cooked and Unexpected Life in Food Politics, you're very welcome to the podcast. Would I be right in saying the field of nutrition chose you rather than you choosing the field of nutrition? Because I believe you fell into it whenever you were told to give a class in nutrition all those years ago when you were teaching at Brandeis University.
Oh, yes, I actually was trained in molecular biology and was a bench scientist for a while. But I couldn't do it because I had young children and I just couldn't manage it. So I took a teaching job and I was teaching cell and molecular biology. And the department had a rule that you could only teach the same class 3 times in a row and then you had to switch to whatever the department needed, whether you knew anything about it or not. And the department, my 3 years were up, and the department, the students were clamoring for human biology classes, and they particularly wanted one in nutrition, and it was just assigned to me. And I, as I've said over and over again, it was like falling in love, and I've never looked back. It was just so much more wonderful to teach than teaching cell and molecular biology, which is a real slog, because everybody can relate to nutrition. Everybody eats. And so the students were really excited about it and willing to do work and willing to do research and willing to do all kinds of things. It was just really fun.
And it also fused your interest in sociology too at the time.
Well, it was obvious to me right from the beginning that the research itself was so difficult to do because you don't know what people are eating and diets change from day to day and certainly from person to person. But even one person's diet is very different from day to day. It's very, very difficult to do research when you don't really know what people's diets are like. And so obviously all these other factors came into it, people's culture and what their religion was and what their belief systems were. I just found all of that absolutely fascinating. And everybody wanted to know about the history and the anthropology and the sociology and the culture and the politics and everything else. And it seemed to me right from the beginning that you could not understand why people ate the way they do unless you understood the agricultural production system, the way food systems worked, and the way the politics of it worked, because there's so much money involved.
When did it first dawn on you that the Western diet was being dictated to by profiteering companies and not by robust science-based public policy?
I didn't think it was in the back of my mind beginning because I was aware of advertising. But I think the turning point the aha moment came when I went to a meeting at the National Cancer Institute in the early 1990s. The meeting was about behavioral causes of cancer and mostly cigarettes. And I certainly knew that cigarettes caused lung cancer. It was pretty well established by then. But I had never heard the anti smoking physicians and scientists talk about it. And what they talked about was the extraordinary efforts that cigarette companies were going to market cigarettes, not only to adults, but also to children. And the, the, the slide presentations that they had were slide after slide after slide of cigarette marketing in places where you wouldn't expect it necessarily, in remote areas of the world, in some of the poorest areas of the world, in places where nobody else could get to. And here they were marketing to cigarettes to the people in those places. And in particular, the presentation on marketing to children was life changing for me because I knew that cigarette companies marketed to children, but the marketing was so ubiquitous and just so much a part of the normal landscape. I'd never noticed it or paid any attention to it. And of course, I realized you're not supposed to pay attention to it because if you pay attention to it, you will start thinking. And if you start thinking, you'll realize how bad this is. And so I walked out of that meeting thinking, we in nutrition should be doing exactly what the anti smoking community is doing for smoking. We should be paying much more attention to marketing. And that's really what did it. I started paying attention.
It's funny because I was actually going to ask you about the similarity between the playbook that big tobacco companies use down through the decades to sell their products to people and food companies selling soda and ultra processed foods to people today. It's exact same playbook, isn't it?
Well, yes, and in particular, because the big cigarette companies bought food companies. And for a period of time, they owned food companies and they taught those companies how to do exactly what they were doing with cigarettes. So the result is the creation of a food environment that encourages people to eat more food, not less. And it's so interesting because these new obesity drugs that have just come out are causing a furor in the food industry. And in the American press, there's been article after article after article about how food companies are trembling in their boots about what the new obesity drugs are going to do to their sales. Because if people are not eating as much and don't want to eat as much, it's going to be very bad for the food business. Something that I've been talking about for years.
You have been synonymous with the term food politics. Indeed, you wrote a book with that title many years
I
ago at this
did.
stage. And you've been synonymous with that term. Can you explain to people who aren't familiar with the term where food and politics intersect?
Well, it was always the first question I was asked when food politics came out and for the first time in 2002. And the question surprised me because it seemed so obvious, and I had just written a whole book about it. But the easiest way to explain it is that in the United States alone, it's a $1.4 trillion business. You know, everybody eats. There's an enormous amount of money involved. And if you are a food company selling a product, you need to find ways to create a favorable business environment for that product. If you're selling something that's junk food and it's not good for people, you've got to protect it in some way. So you want to fund science that will show that the product is harmless or maybe even good for you. You want to make sure that everybody thinks that what you're doing is healthy and wonderful for them. You want to prove that your products are helpful and fun and exciting, and you do that through advertising. But you also do that through immense amounts of lobbying to make sure that no federal agency taxes sodas or in any way issues dietary advice that might suggest eating less of your product. I can't think of a single aspect of the food business that isn't affected by politics in some way or another. But much of that is invisible to the general public because all you think about is going to a supermarket and buying what you want to buy. And you never think of the politics behind supermarkets, which are deliberately set up to get you to buy as much food as possible.
There's a big debate in Ireland at the moment about the impact that agriculture is having, certainly on the environment and just generally on people's overconsumption or consumption of meat products. And there's a lot of pushback, obviously, from the farmers' lobbies, etc. How do we? How does the general society and governments around the world? How do they push back against the vested interests so that they put public health ahead of profits?
Well, some do, some don't. And we're in a period of history right now where um, there's not much interest in public health or in, you know, there's just not much interest in it. I think the pandemic was very damaging to the public health approaches because the pandemic was tough on everybody. It was a very, very difficult period. I hope it's over. The What you want is, I mean, public health was always inherently radical in a way because it was aimed at making everybody healthy, not just rich people or educated people, but everybody. And so the issues of politics get into that because the food industry is not a social service agency, it's not a public health agency, they're businesses. And with stockholders to please, and at least in the United States, pleasing stockholders is considered to be their primary, if not their only, responsibility. Um, so they're in the game for profit. I mean, they could be selling widgets or anything. Their purpose is to make a profit. And if the result of needing to, and I'm not against profits, but if the result of needing profits is to sell products that are not healthy for people, but people like them because they taste good or are formulated to be irresistibly delicious, that's not their problem, that's your problem. We're not forcing you to eat our products. We're just doing everything we can to encourage you, but we're not forcing you to eat them. And so it's your personal responsibility to fight an entire food system on your own, which is what people have to do if they want not to overeat. With overeating being the biggest problem that, at least in the United States, people are dealing with. And so governments issue dietary advice. Some governments issue better dietary advice than others. And if you're in a country where you have a very large meat industry, it's pretty difficult to issue advice to eat less meat, even though eating less meat would be good for probably health and certainly better for the planet. So you have stakeholders and various groups that have vested interests in how people eat. And most people don't think about that when they go to a store. Why would you? When all you're trying to do is feed your family and not go broke in the process.
Generally speaking, what are the links between ultra processed foods and poor health?
Well, ultra processed foods is a new concept relatively. It's only been around since 2009, and it refers to foods that have been industrially produced, don't look anything like the foods that they were derived from, are formulated to be irresistibly delicious. So you can't stop eating them. That's their purpose. They're extremely profitable. They're designed to be. And the sort of easiest definition that I can think of is you can't make it in your home kitchen. If you can make a food in your own kitchen, it's not ultra processed. So if you're making homemade ice cream, that's not ultra processed. If you're frying your own potato chips, that's not ultra processed. And what's important about the concept is that once it was defined, as opposed to other categories of processed foods, canned, frozen, minimally processed, um, you could start doing experiments to see whether that particular category of foods made any difference. And did it ever? And there are now more than 1,000 studies using the word ultra processed in their titles. And all of these studies show without question that people who eat diets that are high in ultra processed foods have um, have more obesity, have more type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cancer, but worse outcomes from COVID-19, overall mortality. The, the associations are extremely strong and extremely consistent, but those are associations and they don't prove causation. But there's one study that was extremely well controlled that shows that eating ultra processed foods gets people to eat more calories without realizing. And this is an extraordinarily well controlled study that I think is one of the most important nutrition studies ever done. The people in that study who were eating this, it was done in a locked metabolic ward where people couldn't cheat on what they were eating or lie about it because the investigators controlled that situation very well. They were eating 500 calories a day more on average than they were when they were eating an unprocessed or minimally processed diet. That's really all you need to know. I mean, that it just accounts for so much of the health outcome and so much of the fact that people have gained so much weight over the last 20 to 40 years. Um, I mean, it's 70% of American adults are overweight or obese. That's just an astonishing percentage. It's normalized being overweight in a way that nobody had ever seen before. So, what do you do about that? Well, governments are not doing anything about eating too much or obesity because it's really bad for business. And if you're trying to control your calorie intake in this kind of food environment, you're fighting a whole food system on yourself. It's really by yourself very, very difficult to do.
I spoke with a bariatric specialist a couple of weeks ago, and he made me rethink the whole notion of responsibility and personal responsibility when it came to obesity, because, as you said, so many people now in America and in the Western world in general are eating more calories per day and are heavier now than they've ever been. And I'm just interested to find out your own position on where personal responsibility comes into what we feed ourselves.
Well, you can only exercise personal responsibility in a situation in which you have reason. If your only choice is to overeat, that's what you're going to do. And that has to do with the way that products are presented in supermarkets. So the most profitable, usually junk foods, are presented in ways that you can't miss them. It's become normal to drink sugar sweetened beverages, which are full of sugar and calories and really are the first thing you want to get rid of if you're trying to lose weight. Um, and if everyone around you is eating in very large portions, and that's what you're presented when you go to a restaurant, exercising personal responsibility in that situation is extraordinarily difficult and unfair, I think. I mean, portion sizes alone are, I think, a sufficient reason for why people are eating more calories. I remember when muffins went from being what are now called mini muffins at about 200 calories a piece to the 600 or 800 calorie humongous things that they are now. And people, when people are presented with one item, they eat it. I don't know. There's something about the way humans are hardwired. We eat what's in front of us, and we're not aware that we're eating so much, especially if it tastes good. And these foods taste good. So it's hard not to eat them if you got them in front of you. So I'm all in favor of personal responsibility. I just think it's really hard to do.
In your 2006 book, What to Eat, you espouse the benefits of the Mediterranean diet. Would you still be of the mind, nearly 20 years later, that that is the best diet to consume?
Well, I never said it was the best. I said it was one of. I think one of the things about diets is that there are an infinite number of ways that you can eat healthfully. And in fact, diet advice is so simple that the journalist Michael Pollan can do it in 7 words. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And that really takes care of it. So any diet that's based on you have to modify food to say relatively unprocessed. Any diet that's based on real foods that haven't been processed to pieces and are balanced in calories and have a lot of plants in them, fruits, vegetables, beans, grains, and so forth, are fine. And the traditional diet of the Mediterranean, which is not consumed anymore, by the way, and the traditional diets in Asia took care of these things very, very well. But yeah, the Mediterranean diet is still touted as a diet that really works well for lots and lots and lots of people. It's fine if you don't eat too much of it.
And is it the case that vegetarians tend to be healthier and live longer than people who would consume meat, for example?
That seems to be the case, and there are plenty of studies that show that. I'm an omnivore myself, and I'm an of the less not no meat is a really good way to eat. But vegetarians do fine, vegans do fine, but they have to be a little bit more careful. I mean, it depends on what you mean by a vegetarian. If you mean by a vegetarian somebody who doesn't eat beef, but eats other kinds of meats and dairy products and animal foods, that's a complete non-issue. They're eating a healthy diet. They're just taking beef out of their diet. But as diets become more restrictive, it gets harder and harder to meet nutritional requirements. And some of the really restrictive diets just don't make any sense to me at all.
Yeah, because you've been critical, I think, in the past of low carb diets, and I presume you would be equally critical of something like the paleo diet today.
Well, I'm equally critical of low fat diets. So the I don't think it matters whether you eat fat or carbohydrate. There's plenty of research that shows that both diets work really, really well if people follow them. The trick is staying on them. And really restrictive diets are very hard to maintain for a long period of time. They're no fun. They're socially difficult. I have a relative who is on a very restricted diet, and she doesn't come to family events because the food is too hard for her. She either has to bring her own food, and it's not because she's sick or anything like that. It's because of the preference. And I just think that it's socially difficult. If you're trying to lose weight, it essentially doesn't matter what kind of a diet you are on, you will lose weight if you stick to the diet. The problem is it's very hard to stick to very restrictive diets. They're just not fun at all.
My penchant is to eat a lot of fish. Now, you have sounded alarm bells about fish in the past, a specific large predatory fish, because of methyl mercury. Can you talk to me about this?
Yeah, I'm fish are on a food chain. Big fish eat little fish eat, and then all the way down. And if you're eating low on the food chain, fish, it's fine. If you're eating the ones that are eating plankton or little things that float around. But there's a fair amount of mercury floating around in the oceans that comes from volcanoes, but also comes from human industrial processes. And that mercury accumulates up the food chain. And so the large predatory fish, and there are only 4 or 5 of them, have far more mercury than is good for health. And the advisories usually suggest not eating very much of those fish. The really big tuna, for example, and sharks and swordfish and things like that. I don't know. Most people don't eat them anyway, but the salmon are okay. They eat low on the food chain.
I hope you don't mind me telling the listeners and the viewers that you are, well, you just recently celebrated, I think, your 87th birthday.
Yes,
Um,
right.
you look marvelous for it and you
Thank
sound
you.
marvelous for it. Could I ask you, you said you're an omnivore. What would your favorite foods be that you would consume?
Oh dear, my favorite food is ice cream. Go figure. Um, the no, I eat according to my advice. I don't find eat food not too much, mostly plants, difficult to follow. And I've eaten that. I happen to like vegetables really a lot. I have gardens. I have two places where I live, and I have gardens in both places. I love growing food. I love eating food I grow. Even on my terrace in Manhattan, I have a fair amount of food growing. Um, and I've just always eaten that way. And if that's what's responsible for still being functional at this age, I'm all for it. But I'm only an N of one.
Well, one final question before I let you go, Professor Nestle. Can I end on an optimistic note? Can we see progress happening as far as educating people is concerned, and as far as a movement towards a healthier policy in relation to food is concerned globally?
Well, I think many, many people are interested in eating healthfully and having food systems that promote healthy eating. I teach in a food studies department where students come in wanting to change the world through food. That's thrilling to be around, and they're the ones who are going to do that if it's possible to do it. I'm not very optimistic about politics these days, but you've caught me in a particularly bad week. Um, and all I can say is that food is something that should bring people together. It should be something that everybody can agree on because it's good that everybody is able to eat healthfully. I wish that it would bring people together and not divide people. And it's up to the younger generation to make sure that that happens. And I'll do everything I can to support them in that work.
Well, I wish you many more years sharing your message and your passion and your love for nutrition. Thank you so much, Professor Marion Nestle, for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here.
Hey there, friends. If you got value from this video, well, you know the deal. Please like, subscribe, share, and I will see you in the next one.